Okay, let's get started then, if that's okay. Thank you so much, everyone, for coming. I'm going to take off the Menti. And yeah, thank you for coming to today's webinar on barriers to education. Before getting started, we're going to introduce ourselves, if that's okay. Yeah.
Hello, I'm Rachel Lyons. I'm an educational psychologist working primarily in Salford, but with links to Bury and Tameside local authorities through a partnership arrangement across the 3 areas.
Hello everyone, I'm Shannon Hatton-Corcoran and I'm an educational psychologist working in Trafford.
Thank you. I'm Andy. I'm the founder and creative director of Spectrum Gaming, which is a community for autistic young people.
Hi everyone, I'm Kirstine Wilshire. My background is as a social worker in adoption and fostering, so my main interest has always been trauma. But through my family experiences of barriers to attendance and difficulties with education, I'm now an independent social worker, and this is kind of my main interest. And I only recently realised that I'm ADHD and autistic as well, which has been fun.
Hi everyone, I'm Dr. Hannah Benton-Platts and I'm clinical psychologist at Spectrum Gaming.
Hi everyone, I'm Caroline Bond and I'm one of the trainers in educational psychology at the University of Manchester, and also with various trainees on our programme. I've been undertaking quite a lot of work in relation to this area, so hopefully that's helpful today.
Well, thank you.
Good to meet you.
Before moving on, I forgot to share my screen with sound, and there's a video later, so I'm going to reshare it. So I hope that's okay. Okay, everything's back. Okay, so for today, one thing we felt it was quite important to mention is we think that the barriers to education is quite a tricky topic, which has quite lots of emotion associated from all sides. But the purpose of today is to start to create a way forward of everyone working together to focus on the best possible outcomes for young people. If you aren't in the right mindset to look at things in this way today, that's perfectly okay. And the webinar will be recorded, so you can watch it at any time. And Bobby's put a link in the chat for if you need any support with anything as well. I mentioned in the email yesterday, but our original plan was to have 3 webinars, and the aim was to cover sort of similar content. The reason for this is what we're developing aims to be truly collaborative. So what we aim to show is over time how everyone's input from today and the other people we're working with has led to the guidance changing and improving over time. But then we realised there is so much content and so much change that we feel is needed, but actually we really need to deep dive onto different topics so you can really get to hear a lot of the rationale and context behind a lot of what we're hoping to do. So instead, we've changed it into a bit of like a 3-part webinar series. So today we aim to focus on the case for change, but also the key principles we're hoping to adopt across the guidance, and also talking a bit more about the next steps planned and also how you can get involved in this project. The second webinar aims to have a bit of a deep dive into relational approaches, because that is such a huge topic which we feel we need to share quite a lot about, and also having a focus on what you should do when young people start struggling to attend. And then the third webinar aims to be a deep dive into long-term absence. So if a young person's been out of school for a really long time, what's helpful, what isn't, and looking more into that. The plan for today, it's split into 4 sections. The first bit is the rationale. So why do we need new guidance? The second is the journey so far. What have we done as a team to work together to address what people are currently experiencing? Then having a break, and then looking at the key acknowledgements we've made. There's a really nice acronym it fits into, which is warmth. So you can treat people with warmth. It feels really nice. So we want to talk through that, and then go on to what's next. What are intended outcomes? How can you get involved? And if you want to adopt the guidance, because lots of local authorities are welcome to work with us, then we can talk more about that. Over to you, Rachel.
Thank you, Andy. So just to set the context, this project started as a way to address a gap we were all experiencing in our direct work with children and families. We wanted to collaborate to find a way that would better meet the needs of the children we were working with who were unable to attend school, a group for whom at the time there appeared to be no readily available solution with either within the current guidance or the research literature. And this coincided with a huge rise in interest and discussion about this topic, where rightfully the perspectives of those with lived experience have been amplified. Due to us having very different work backgrounds and professional roles, we are aware of the complexities and competing demands within this area, and it's something that we have spent a lot of time considering and discussing. We are very aspirational in what we hope this guidance will change, We're also very aware of the boundaries and stresses within the current educational systems, so intend for it to be highly practical and easy to navigate. Okay, so we're going to go on now to think about the rationale and why we need some new guidance. And Caroline is going to kick us off with some data about the UK context.
Thanks very much, Rachel. And I'm sure many of you are very aware of the context, but I think it's helpful just to remind ourselves of where we currently are, particularly in England. So obviously, since COVID, there's been a significant increase in the rates of non-attendance, and obviously they're variable for different groups. Also, alongside that, there's pre-existing kind of concerns that we might have as well. So we know that there's been a significant increase in mental health difficulties among children and young people, and that's been since 2010. So that's not a kind of a COVID specific factor, although COVID may have exacerbated a number of these kind of underlying concerns that were already pre-existing. Some of the other challenges that we also currently face relate to the school system itself. So we know that there's lots of challenges around teacher recruitment and retention, and that's a particular concern where we know young people are perhaps struggling to find a sense of belonging in school, and if they've got a succession of supply teachers, that's going to kind of be a significant barrier to being able to kind of attend school regularly and receive the support you need. Similarly, there's been a reduction in funding for schools, and that has had a disproportionate effect in certain areas. So we know that special educational needs funding and kind of TA support particularly have been affected, which again is likely to have a significant effect on certain groups of young people. Similarly, the arts is another area which for many young people might be a kind of a particular kind of area of interest that might draw them into school. So if there's not funding for the arts and those kind of broader range of curricula aren't necessarily available, that again can be a kind of a challenge for young people. And we know from some surveys of secondary young people's experiences that quite a lot of young people generally, not just those with attendance difficulties, are perhaps less happy with school at the moment because at secondary there is less choice and there's a lot more focus on exams, which can make things more stressful. So a knock-on effect of kind of those sort of difficulties that we're noticing within education has been an increase in special educational needs funding and rises in EHCP requests, because obviously young people's needs aren't perhaps being met well within our current system, which is then putting stress on other parts of education resources. Similarly, the cost of living crisis we know has also had a massive effect on families, and just those kind of financial issues and financial challenges are going to have an impact on young people being able to get into school, having their uniform, having had breakfast, all those basic things that need to be in place so that young people can access the curriculum. And then also we know that there's been significant shifts in parental perceptions around school attendance. So this notion that every day matters is perhaps less shared by all parents, and so that's a challenge as well for schools, that many parents don't necessarily feel that every day is quite so essential to attendance. And that breakdown, that change in culture around attendance hasn't been specifically driven by COVID and parents working from home. It's much more to do with young people's needs not being met in schools, increases in mental health difficulties, and the impact of poverty as well. So the Children's Commissioner is kind of right to highlight the fact that there are lots of children that are missing. There are thousands of children missing out on education. And because of the issues around the kind of data that we have, we don't necessarily know where those children are or what their underlying needs are. So there's a massive challenge for us in relation to kind of attendance generally. So next slide, please, Andy. So we've already mentioned the fact that, you know, there has been this significant increase in absence rates, and they have almost doubled. And although they seem to have plateaued a little bit, there doesn't seem to have been the decrease that perhaps many people were expecting post-COVID. So the rates haven't decreased back down to pre-COVID levels. And we also know that these challenges have particularly affected certain groups more than others. So young people with mental health needs or special educational needs, or young people where their kind of financial challenges for their families are particularly affected. And also there's different rates in different parts of the education sector. So, but across special schools, secondary and primary, attendance rates have all increased, non-attendance rates have all increased. We also know that, again, for mental health needs, that young people where there is a probable mental health difficulty, that their rates of absence are significantly higher, so at 12% compared to those without a probable mental health difficulty. So next slide, please, Andy. So the Children's Commissioner has obviously been trying to kind of highlight this issue and has been undertaking quite a lot of work in this area, which I think is very promising and very encouraging. So the first, one of the first report, their Attendance is Everyone's Business, was one of the first pieces of work that was undertaken. And it was a survey looking at the experiences of young people themselves. And young people highlighted the fact that they want to be attending school, but there's barriers that stop them from attending. So that might be being a young carer, or it might be that they've got special educational needs. So I think that report was very helpful in kind of highlighting that kind of young people are keen to attend. Similarly, the Missing Children, Missing Grades report focused on Key Stage 4 young people, and it highlighted the fact that young people who were missing education, were persistently or severely absent in Year 10, were much more likely to have poorer GCSE outcomes, and that pattern of persistent or severe absence was likely to continue into Year 11. So these kind of ongoing kind of trends are really important for us to be able to kind of understand and address at a much earlier point. I've already mentioned the Burton, Shaw and Dorrell report, and I know that will be referred to again. The final report there from Impact Ed is another really useful report because it draws on data from survey data from 126 schools nationally in England. And although they weren't representative, they do highlight a broad range of issues in relation to non-attendance. And they highlight the fact that it's intersectional. So we can't kind of necessarily make assumptions about the reasons for young people's attendance. We actually need to kind of explore that with young people and their families to try to understand what the factors might be. And there are certain groups who are particularly at risk. So we know that if you're a Year 11 girl with special educational needs receiving pupil premium, you're at much more risk of non-attendance than other groups. So we really need to kind of understand individual circumstances and be able to kind of track the data much better so that we can spot trends and patterns earlier and hopefully support young people from an earlier point. And interestingly, the Impact Ed report also highlighted that developing a sense of belonging, developing relationships in school is much more important in terms of better outcomes for young people than sanctions. So again, it's about kind of how we think about our culture around attendance. Next slide, please, Andy. And there's a recent rapid review that's come out, and this rapid review is very helpful. It's actually not even published yet, and I think it's useful because it draws together the qualitative studies which help us to understand the factors which might underpin absence. So qualitative research is really helpful for helping us to kind of understand factors, and a factor had to appear in at least 5 studies, and they're all international set of studies. So a factor had to occur across 5 studies to be part of the model on the left. And as you can see, the factors on the left are not ones that are surprising to us, but I think it just helps to kind of crystallize that knowledge and help us to kind of be much more confident in starting to address some of these barriers on the left. So at the school level, teacher-pupil relationships, school safety, academic achievement, and supporting children's learning needs. At the student level, we also know that it's general health and mental health needs and adverse child experiences are important, as well as age and year. So as I said on the last slide, there are certain differences according to age range, and we know that the year 7 to 8 transition is another kind of important issue, and somebody will come back to that later on. And then finally, in terms of family factors, economic disadvantage and lower levels of parental education are going to make it more tricky for families to then kind of navigate the school environment and be able to work together with schools potentially. So I think that those kind of background factors are all kind of really helpful underpinnings just to be aware of. Thank you, Andy.
So I'm going to speak a little bit now about what young people say on this. And as Rachel said earlier, within this project, one of our main things is to amplify the voices of the people experiencing this. It's those children, young people at the centre of this crisis. And I think it's really key that we take on board, what is their experience? And I can see lots of you saying in the chat already, lots of your own experiences of this, and they do really align. So on this slide, there's a study that's only recently been completed, which got the views from 640 children and young people through a survey from year 5 to year 13. Most were attending school, but some were not attending school at the time. So hopefully it's a fair reflection of some of the picture of what's happening at the moment. And what Dr. Papula and Dr. Sivers found within their survey was that 37% of the children they spoke to reported finding it difficult to cope with everyday school life. 52% identified school as having a negative impact on their mental health, so including stress, worry, fear, workload, rules and relationships within school. So that's over half of the children that they spoke to said that school was negatively impacting their mental health, which is obviously huge. And there's a quote there from one of the young people who completed the survey who just said, "School is too much pressure." Within this, though, they did find positively things in school that had a positive influence on mental health were predominantly around those relationships with their family and their friends. So having people that they trusted and that support was really, really helpful in those that were attending. Next slide, please, Andy. And this is a bigger survey, which is one of the ones that Caroline mentioned earlier, which surveyed over 30,000 young people. And again, really similar themes coming out of that of what the young people were reporting. So a huge factor, which will come up a lot through our slides today, is sense of belonging. A key factor in what motivated children and supported them going to school regularly was feeling that they belonged and that they were safe within the school environment. And for those that struggled with attendance, they were the main things they reported as barriers. They also identified the second transition from year 7 to year 8, particularly for those premium pupils with SEND. And that sense of belonging again seemed to take a bit of a hit within year 8. They felt maybe there was more support in year 7 and then they moved up and that support fell back and they really struggled then to keep up their attendance. It also, as Caroline touched on, mentioned a lot about intersectional factors. So it's not just picking one demographic of a pupil, right? Those pupils, for example, pupil premium are always going to struggle. It was more complex than that, and it was about how the different demographic factors interacted to create almost a perfect storm of those pupils who really are at risk here. So, for example, as Caroline mentioned earlier, a female pupil who's eligible for pupil premium and has a special educational need are particularly likely to struggle with their attendance. So for schools, this is really important to think about. How do we safeguard those children? How do we work with those children and families to reduce those risks and make sure their school experience is a positive one? And the survey gives us a bit of an answer to that. It does tell us how we can support. And as is probably not a surprise to most of you here today, the pupils survey did say that understanding sanctions and consequences was not strongly linked to their ability to attend school. So knowing that they were going to be rewarded or punished didn't affect their ability to attend school regularly. What did was having a school that supported them to understand why they were going. What's the purpose of school? Could they see how that contributed to their future? Did they understand why it was important to go to school? And also their relationships with the other children and with the teachers in school was really, really important, again, to build that sense of safety and sense of belonging within the school environment. Next slide, please, Andy. And this quote, I think, summarises something that has really come out as my sense really from all of the research that I've read over the past few years. And there's a quote here that says, "The mental health crisis in young people is a huge compounding issue around attendance." And I think that's a really important point to bear in mind throughout all of this, is that ultimately attendance is the symptom. It's not the problem. The problem underneath that is a school system that's not working for children and young people. And they're the canaries in the coal mine, aren't they? They're telling us that this isn't working for them by withdrawing from school. And that's why it's really important that we do this work and that we get it right for them. Thank you, Andy.
So is it time to rethink attendance? David Hayne has done a huge amount of research on non-attendance, and he's thought to be one of the leading academics in his field, and has worked to bring researchers together via the International Network for School Attendance to generate change. He too started with the aim to develop interventions that would support children to return to school, but has very recently co-authored a series of articles published in January with the aim to challenge conventional thinking. Calling for much better multi-agency collaboration and a radical overhaul of the field of school attendance, he argued that attendance is about more than seat time and being present in school buildings, but instead it should be about how young people are enabled to engage with learning and be prepared for adulthood. Next slide, please, Andy. So if the goal of education is to prepare young people for the future, rather than focusing all of our efforts on the blue arrows, which is what we're doing currently, increase school attendance in the hope that the dotted blue arrows will lead to readiness for adulthood, instead, we'd have more success if we considered the green arrows, a change in focus to think about well-being and learning, and a willingness to support learning wherever it occurs best for that young person. Next slide, please, Andy. So why a local authority approach? Developing effective multi-agency working takes a effective multi-agency working takes a local authority approach, one that is shared and owned across teams rather than driven by a single service. Research shows that multi-agency approaches provide collaborative advantage, benefits that are cumulative, resulting in more efficient working practices, coordination, shared resources, responsibilities, and risk. Research in a Greater Manchester local authority referenced on the slide demonstrated how a multi-agency approach to reducing barriers to attendance led to earlier identification and intervention and allowed misconceptions to be challenged and a more evidence-based approach to be adopted consistently. And this leads to better experiences for children and families. In Greater Manchester in particular, children may live in one local authority and attend a school in another. So some consistency between local authorities is important. Also, developing guidance is time-consuming and effortful at a time when services are very stretched. A great deal of duplication and reinvention of the wheel could be saved if we were to work more collaboratively across Greater Manchester, and therefore why not nationally? I've never collaborated more on a topic than on this. I've been contacted by various professionals, not just EPs, in services across England, Wales, and Northern Ireland. And it was this willingness to share learning and to collaborate that led to the creation of the North West EBSA Interest Group, which Andy is going to talk about later.
Thank you. And yeah, as you can see, we've got quite a really cool, diverse team here to present to everyone today. And I thought it might be helpful to talk a bit more about the journey so far and how we got to where we are and how many people have been involved with this. So first, if you don't know about Spectrum Gaming, you might be thinking, why is like a gaming charity here? That doesn't make sense. So just to explain, so I am the founder of Spectrum Gaming. I am autistic and had quite a lot of negative experiences growing up. And then I sort of made it my sort of like goal to make sure as many young people as possible avoid the struggles sort of my generation and previous generations of young people have experienced. So I started to get involved with a lot of advocacy work. So I made like a Facebook page about autism. I joined my local Send Youth forum. And we had this thing of we would share our views around how things could be done differently, and people would thank us for our time, but things didn't always change based on what we said. So I ended up being really, really cheeky in my local authority and wrote a 40-page report around what we thought wasn't going well in the local area and what could be done differently. And then I was offered a full-time job as an advocate for Send Young people in my local area. And that included then becoming the co-chair of it's a really long name, the Northwest Send Young People's Co-Production Network, where I aim was to sort of share best practice and make sure the views of Send Young people have sort of become more prolific across the Northwest. While that was happening, it was really epic to be able to put Send Young people's views at the forefront. But then it was that thing of like, we shared people's views and then we were waiting for someone to do something with them. And then I got to the point of thinking like, why wait when we can just do it ourselves, which sounds really bad. So Stretching Gaming was born. So Stretching Gaming is a community for autistic young people where we focus a lot on friendships and connection. But as a result of that, we also do a lot of advocacy work. So because young people become really confident in our community, they then have a really, really strong voice. And then we run projects based on the priorities of young people in our community. One example is last year we launched Autism Understood. This is a website about autism for autistic young people. We made it with around 50 young people and around 50 adults, with 8 young people who were project managers for that project. So that was really, really epic. But of course, the biggest thing young people talk about in our community is barriers to education. One thing I wanted to mention here is a lot of the journey so far is very autism and SEND focused. But we'll go on to explain a bit more about that. But also, I want to say here, in case it's helpful, our aim isn't to create guidance for SEND young people. It's about having the right guidance for everyone. But we'll come on to that a little bit later. So at the moment, Stretching Gaming has 1,700 members. Around 80% are classed as persistently absent from school, and around 60% have experienced longer-term attendance difficulties. So that's a very large part of our community. But as I said, we have a very keen focus on advocacy and making sure young people's views are heard. So around 25% of our community have shared insight around school attendance. So that's around 420 autistic young people. And when I say this, it isn't just like having a survey or a casual chat, but we have lots of really, really in-depth, deep dive discussions around different issues. So we have quite a large network of young people's views. I wanted to quickly say, at this point, I wanted to share some sort of quotes and stories from families and young people, but I wanted to give a bit of a warning around it. The reason is that I didn't want to share these with the intention of creating any feelings of shame or guilt or anything like that from anyone. We've just made the recognition that a lot of people on the ground are working very, very hard and know about the gaps, but some people who don't work directly with families might not be aware of the stories and themes that come from families. So we wanted to talk through some of those. I'm sorry, sorry, I'm quite anxious. I'm getting out of breath, but I'm gonna be 1 second. Yeah, we've been dreaming of having an opportunity to sort of influence the guidance for a very long time. So this feels really important for us all. So it's a little bit terrifying, but yeah. Anyway, we'll carry on. So one of the big things, what I wanted to say here is we wanted to talk about some of the key themes around what hasn't worked so well with the current guidance at the moment. So one of the biggest ones is having a distinction between emotionally based school avoidance and truancy. In lots of local areas, people sort of make that choice, and then this can be quite difficult for a lot of people. So there's some quotes here which say, school said he was choosing to not attend school until he eventually broke, and then it was too late. My junior school said I was definitely not autistic and I was fine in school. Once I'd been dragged in crying, I wasn't fine at all. I was breaking inside all the time. And I think what happens, what we see in our community a lot is a young person struggles to attend school. They're told that they're sort of truanting or choosing not to attend, when the truth is that they're really, really struggling. So when you get to choose between emotionally based school avoidance or truanting, sometimes that leads to a lot of negative things happening for young people and families because sometimes the wrong choice is made. The second thing, one of the most popular beliefs that's quite widespread at the moment is this idea that the longer you're out of school, the worse your anxiety gets. So we need to push people back in as soon as possible. But there's some quotes from families here, which you can see. I'll just read a couple. This is very sad to read. Had they taken seriously what a child had told them, he may not have gotten to the point where he tried to take his own life. Even then, they still tried to force him back into school. He needed time to recover and instead was pushed to such an extent that he felt suicide was the only way out of his situation. It's really, really tricky to hear that. But also, that isn't something we've only heard once. We've heard it over and over, where a young person struggling to attend school, the focus is on pushing them back in. And that has been really, really detrimental to their well-being. When we look at reasons behind this, it makes a lot of sense. And we've got a really cheeky sort of explanation behind this of when you have this idea of like the longer you're away, the bigger your anxiety gets. it assumes that there's no reason behind your anxiety. It's irrational anxiety that makes no sense. But a lot of young people and families report that there are real reasons behind why young people can struggle to go to school, or if they do attend school, why they might feel quite unsafe or anxious. So the aim of sort of pushing people back in is that idea of your anxiety is irrational, but then if we push you through it, your brain will realize there's nothing to actually be scared of, and then things will feel okay. But when there are real reasons behind struggling to attend school, it's completely different to that. The analogy I always think of is if I said to you, hey, I want you to get used to getting punched in the face. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to start with sort of touching you quite lightly, and then I'm going to go towards sort of like poking you, and then eventually, bam, I'm going to punch you in the face. And then like you have that small steps grade exposure type approach. But at the end of the day, you're still getting punched in the face. Like the end outcome is something that is quite unpleasant and isn't very helpful. So those small steps or that pushback in only works if there isn't a real threat. But for a lot of young people, there is. So doing that approach isn't always very helpful. And then what happens is when people experience a high level of stress, the way people process their experiences is very different as well. So sorry, 1 second. I think I'm going to hide the chat for a second because I keep trying to read it while I'm talking and it's not very helpful. But what then happens is when you're really, really stressed, then the way you sort of process things is very, very different. So please let me know if I've lost you with this. But whenever you experience anything, your brain has two different ways. It's two different places where it stores the experience. One part of your brain is called the hippocampus. This is quite easy to describe as being a bit like a library. So when you experience things when you're quite calm and relaxed, it's a bit like writing a story in a book, and that's then placed in the library, and it's quite safe to recall. You can remember the facts and the things that happened during that situation, and that's the main way that people sort of store their memories. However, when you experience something while you're under a high level of stress, that memory isn't stored in the hippocampus. Instead, it's stored in the amygdala. The amygdala is a very primitive part of your brain, and it's part of like what it takes over when you're sort of in survival mode and you have that sort of fight or flight response. When memories are stored here, they're less factual, they're less about the information, and they're more sort of fragmented and emotional. And when you have memories which are stored in the amygdala, your brain then tries to work out possible sort of warning signs or reasons why things can be dangerous. And then your anxiety and stress can get bigger and bigger. And then okay, I'm waffling a bit, sorry. But the point of what I'm trying to say here is when you have anxiety around school and oh my gosh, I'm so sorry. Did you get the point that I was making? Can I move on? I'm sorry, I'm normally completely fine, but yeah. Okay. Yeah, I don't know. Okay, I'll move on. Anyway, one of the biggest things we've seen is, again, going back to the idea of we must push people back into school as quickly as possible. When people have real reasons behind anxiety and you're pushed into that anxiety, it can make your anxiety get bigger rather than smaller. And this is something we've seen quite a lot. And an example I think of with this is, let's say you have a phobia of spiders, and if you see them, you are absolutely terrified. If I then pick up a spider and throw it at your face, that doesn't help with your phobia of spiders. It makes it get bigger. Then what might happen is you might be scared of like dark corners of a room, or be scared of like looking under your bed in case there's a spider in there. And if your anxiety gets even bigger, you might be scared of a dark room in case there's a dark area, in case there's a spider there, and your anxiety can get bigger and bigger and bigger, and then things can become more difficult. And this is the exact same thing we've seen with a lot of our young people, where people start with a lot of anxiety around school, but then if they're pushed back in before they're ready, then people become anxious about going to their local youth club, or anxious about leaving the house, or even struggling to leave their room. And in our community, there's lots of young people right now who are in the exact same situation, where because they were really anxious and they were pushed into doing things, they're then unable to do a lot of the things which they used to love and things which they really want to do. Not because they don't want to do those things, but because they feel unable to. And within the autistic population, one commonly used term is something called autistic burnout. And that is where sort of you've been in survival mode for so long because your brain's become so hypervigilant that your brain just completely runs out of energy. So people go from doing lots of things and going to school every day to being able to do nothing whatsoever. And it's like a complete reset where you feel like you've lost all your sense of safety, and it can take a really, really long time to then go ahead and recover from that. And this is a really, really, really common experience in a lot of young people we support. And one of the interesting things is this is a quote from a parent which says, "We experienced a teacher off sick with mental health challenges for half a school year who was supported, nurtured, understood, whereas our child in the same situation was treated as refusing, us as bad parents, and that we should do whatever it took to get him in, presumably including physical force." So you have this interesting thing where as an adult, if you're really anxious or stressed or you're off sick, you're treated with a lot of like nurturing compassion. Whereas if a young person struggles to attend school, the message is more like, we must get them in quickly before anxiety gets worse. They don't always get that same sort of break and recovery that they need. And that's then what leads to things like burnout, which has happened to quite a lot of young people. And the key thing that we've seen is some of the current guidance which is currently used. When we work with young people, we have seen that sometimes it has had quite a big negative impact on those young people. But we've also noticed that when people use a different approach, when they've seen the guidance but done something else, we've seen very different things happen. One example, I don't know. I think Spectrum Gaming is like a perfect example of this, where we run face-to-face meetups in Manchester, but then we have young people come from all across the country to sort of come to our meetups. So, for example, on Saturday we had a football meetup, and a young person who's been in burnout for a couple of years has built a really strong sense of safety and trust with our community members. So he drove for 5 hours from Bournemouth to come to our football meetup on Saturday, and we have other young people who come across the country to come to our forest school. And in July, we did a meetup in London. And when it came to the meetup, around 80% of the young people were persistently absent or didn't attend any other social groups or activities. But then because of the relationships we've developed, they felt safe enough to come to what we ran. So it was really magical to see that. And that's our experience. But then you can see other sort of places which are giving similar messages too. So there's some great books like Your Child Is Not Broken. In Your Child Is Not Broken, Heidi says about how she was encouraged to get her son to sort of like touch the gate at school as the first step to go back in. But then they recognise that this actually caused more harm and made things more difficult rather than better. We've got Can't Not Won't from Eliza Fricker, which talks about the slow recovery that comes from the damage that was caused from being pushed into school before her young person was ready. You've got Not Finding School. This is they run a Facebook support group for parents of young people who struggle to attend school. At the moment, it has 56,000 members, and you hear a lot about how some of the current approaches aren't always very helpful, but also about when people have done different approaches, they've found what really, really works. And it was really great to hear about the research earlier, because there's lots more research which is starting to match a lot of what we've seen in our community and with wider experiences. So, for example, this is an approach from Dr. Jerica Holder, who was one of the lead people in writing the original sort of emotionally based school avoidance guidance. When that term was first starting to be used, and this is focused on the idea of when a young person has had long-term absence from school, people need a lot of time and care and support and nurture to be able to sort of recover from their experiences, find their sense of safety again, and then go on to learn and be curious. And again, this is a really strong theme that we've seen in our community and wider. And the way we sort of feel as a team right now is, while the current sort of emotionally based school avoidance guidance, as we saw in the poll at the start, a lot of people say that it's not been very helpful as a whole, but actually it was the next stage from the idea of everyone being school refusers and the damage that sort of idea perpetuated. So I think we're moving together on a journey to get to, okay, we had school refusal. Now then we had emotionally based school avoidance. What's next? How do we move from that to something that's better? In addition to hearing from stories and things on social media and more updated research, there's also been some people who've been putting new approaches into practice as well. I did an interview with the EBSA support service in Northeast Links. So they got funding for a 12-month project where they aim to do things a little bit differently. So rather than focusing on teaching families sort of coping strategies and resilience, they focused on advocacy. So working with a family to work out what unmet needs they had and advocated for them to be met in the school environment. One common thing that people say is you were offered support sort of a bit too late. So they used a self-referral system where a family can refer themselves into the service to get support when they feel like they need it. Their support was person-centered and long-term, rather than having like a 6-week block and then off you go. It was focused on what people really, really need. And this service was shown to be massively, massively impactful for all the families that it supported. It was a 12-month funded service, so it isn't running anymore, but it sounded really, really amazing. Yeah. So while this project is backed by a lot of research, one of the things that I think is quite special about our team is a lot of the work is very community-led, and lived experience is at the heart of a lot of what we've done. So I wanted to talk a bit about some of the views and voices that we've captured over time to lead to today. So I wanted to start back in 2019, where actually this is the year before Spectrum Gaming was launched. So I was tasked in Greater Manchester to set up co-production groups with autistic young people to make sure their voices were heard in work that's happening in Greater Manchester. And what we actually had was like a chicken and the egg situation, where young people recognised that, as you can see as a quote, how can I possibly advocate for myself when I use all of my energy just trying to survive? So instead of setting up advocacy groups, I wrote a report which set out 10 key priorities that autistic young people had. And this was, at the time, I think it was the biggest consultation on the views of autistic children and young people, because it captured reviews of around 2,900. As part of this work, they also wanted to make a video to sort of share their views around how things are at the moment. Another warning, this is a really sad video, so you might want to not listen for 3 minutes if you aren't okay with it. But I did a survey of autistic young people, then made a rap video where each line of a rap is a response someone gave to the survey, and this was to sort of complement the work that we were doing around this. So I'll play that now.
Angry, anxious, sad and exhausted. This list of how I feel is not exhaustive. I'm not alone in this, but I feel so alone. How am I going to last until I am fully grown? I cry every single day and I'm begging you, please help the pain go away. If I could change one thing about my life, I would be dead. There are so many challenges that I am facing. School, I hate it. School, let's face it, I deal with bullies on an everyday basis. School is the reason I have depression. It has failed me all my life. School makes me feel inadequate and dead inside. Please stop the bullying. Stop punishing me. Stop putting me down. I'm trying my best, can't you see? School makes me not want to be here anymore. I'm told I have to go, but what the heck for? I'd rather be dead than go to school. Enough of these questions, mommy, get out of my room. I want to change my life. I want a friend. I feel like a burden. When will this ever end? I want to feel like I've done something right. I want to be able to sleep at night. I feel like nobody understands me. Life is so lonely, that's our reality. Please help me to make some friends. I want to be invited to play on the weekend. So many of us feel this way. We hope to be able to meet someday. I want a space where we feel safe and at home. A chance to be united and not struggling on our own. A place where people understand and are like me. Where I can be bold and free and out of the lonely world that I'm living in now. I want more sports and games and music anyhow. I want to feel happy and strong and feel like I'm doing something right for once. Right now I hate the conditions that I have, but I would like to be proud of who I am.
I'll leave it there. And then the following year, as I said before, Spectrum Gaming, I was co-chair of a Northwest, again a really long Northwest Send Young People's co-production network. And one of the things we wanted to do was map out young people's priorities across Greater Manchester. And these are some of the stats that came up. So 34.4% said they were unsure they felt safe at their education setting. 60% were unsure they would reach their goals, and around 82% said that they worry quite a lot, which is quite sad to see. Then in 2021/2022, that's when we started to do our official work around barriers to education, and when me, Rachel, Shannon, and other people started to come together to sort of really deep dive into some of the problems and sort of what can help. So as I said earlier, we do things a bit differently sometimes. So what we did, these things which we call live writing sessions, where we use some online software called Gather Room, and then we had young people, professionals, and parents all met together in this virtual space to sort of debate and discuss and really deep dive on different issues and what can help with that sort of thing. So over that time, we had 350 autistic young people, 150 autistic adults, 600 parents and carers, and 80 professionals all coming together to look at key themes and topics. When we spoke to young people in particular, here are some of the things which we looked at. So we looked at the EBSA guidance that existed at that time and sort of reviewed it together and wrote some feedback around it. And we talked to young people about what staff should be like who support them. A lot of young people have said when we started struggling to attend school, it was like they lost their spark and sort of lost their sort of passion for learning. So we talked about sort of when people have lost their spark, how do they gain it again? Because every young person wants to learn, but people can have barriers to doing that. What was unhelpful on their journey when they were struggling to attend school? What do they wish was done differently? But also looking at the reasons why school can be hard for people. So we had lots of different jambos and other things that people shared their views. And one of the reasons this is important is one big debate that's currently happening is like what terminology should be used when people struggle to attend school. And I wanted to say a bit about why we are using the term barriers to education. So when we went to our young people to talk about terminology, a lot of people said they hate the term emotionally based school avoidance because the term avoidance sort of puts the onus on young people and it can feel quite medicalized. The second reason is because that puts the onus on young people, it doesn't really work for them because the majority of our young people said the reasons behind attendance difficulties were linked to the environment themselves, not them. So it didn't really connect. The third thing which came up was the idea that education is much more important than attendance. There's lots of young people in our community who've talked about how they might have gone to school, but they were too anxious to be able to learn and process information. There's some young people who go to school and they sit in the corridor all day. So they have 100% attendance, but they're not actually learning. So education is more important than attendance. Fourth, we're aiming to create guidance that works for everyone. Again, we'll come on to that soon. And finally, this is the preferred term for young people. So while everyone has different opinions on what terminology should be used, this was the preferred term among the wide group of young people who we spoke with. Then the final bit here is in 2023/24, we launched a survey online to sort of ask parents and carers about sort of emotional-based school avoidance, the current guidance that exists, and what could be done differently. We had 179 responses. It was over 60,000 words, so it was a lot. And Nanny Art reviewed and analysed all of the information, which was quite difficult because there were lots of really sad, heartbreaking stories within that. And here are some of the key themes. So what doesn't work? People said focusing on attendance, ignoring well-being and mental health, non-compliance of school, local authorities, parent blaming and child blaming. When we asked what key values and beliefs people should have, people said compassion, focusing on the child's voice, understanding mental health, tailoring things to the individual, the parent's voice, and also changing the school environment. If your young person's doing well, what has helped? A lot of people said that they're not in school, it's not applicable, but then it comes down to trust and safety, going to a new environment. And what we've seen is when young people have gone back to school, two things have really helped. One is either going to a completely new environment or making sure there's massive adaptations if they're going back to the same one. Having supportive staff, I won't go through them all. If your young person's doing well, what's made things more difficult? People have said non-compliance with legal duties, educating professionals, bullying, mental health, not understanding neurodiversity. So yeah, so I said earlier, this bit was very autism and sort of SEND focused. And while again this guidance isn't for everyone, one of the reasons for this is when it comes to struggling to attend school, it is one of the biggest groups who do struggle with barriers to education. So there was some research from last year which showed 92% of those experiencing school distress were identified as neurodivergent, and 83% were identified as autistic. And one of the things that's commonly said is that it's something that's happened post-COVID, but actually there's research that shows that this persistent absence happened before COVID as well. So in one study showed that persistent absence was reported in 43% of parents of autistic children before it. Sorry, I'm losing myself. Yeah, okay. So I wanted to quickly share what the team is for the project, because the team is much wider than everyone who's talking here today. So we have a steering group of people who are working together. So you've got representatives. We've also got Naniot, who's an amazing advocate, and we've got Anna, who is a neurodivergent parent to neurodivergent children. Kirsty, who is our under 13 community manager at Spectrum Gaming. We've also got a young people's group. It says 16 young people here. The reason for this is we've had 16 autistic young people who have experienced barriers to education who would like to co-write and co-produce the guidance with us. There are lots more who are going to be involved. And the same with parents. We currently have a parent community of 25 parents or carers of young people who've experienced barriers to education who would like to co-produce and co-write this guidance with us. Is also the Northwest EBSA interest group, which is currently made up of around 40 practitioners who have an interest in this topic. Then we've also asked a few really awesome people if they would like to be involved in shaping this with us. So the aim is, so the people we've got here are Beth Bodycott from Not Finding School, Eliza Fricker from Missing the Mark, Eddie Costello is here from Square Peg, hello, Dr. Naomi Fisher, Dr. Ruth Morris, who's also here, I saw you earlier, hello, Professor Caroline Bond, who's presenting today, and many more. And finally, everyone who's here today. So one of the things which we're really keen to say is we're on a sort of journey together where we really want to collaborate with what we're doing. So when you leave the webinar today, there is going to be a survey which has 12 questions on it. So if you have time, please do fill it in, because everything people says there will influence what we're going to create. We've intentionally not started to write anything yet because we want to make sure what we're doing is definitely right based on what everyone's saying. We have some Menti questions a bit later on. And also in the post-webinar survey, it has a question asking if you would like to get involved, what your experience is, how we can work together. So please do feel welcome to fill that in as well. And yeah, you're welcome to join our journey and get on board, because lots of areas have this exact same priority. So rather than all doing it separately, why don't we just do it together? That makes a lot of sense. So the plan is after this webinar, we'll get everyone's feedback, use that to start to structure, okay, what do we definitely need? What bits do we need to tweak? And then we plan to work with the people we've got in the national experts section. I didn't get their permission to cover national experts. I did it anyway. So sorry if that's a bit cringe, but but there you go. So we want to work with everyone in this group once we've created the structure after this webinar today. So again, your feedback is really essential. Through this work, yeah, you'll have a shareable feedback link after the webinar today as well. So through this work, we have recognised 4 important key acknowledgements for moving forward together. So we're going to go through the 4 key acknowledgements, and then we're going to have a break. It's me talking through them. I'm sorry if you're fed up with my voice, but after a break, it's not me anymore. So yeah, I'm going to have a quick drink. Okay. So through this work, we've recognised 4 important key acknowledgements for moving forward together, based on all of the research and the consultation and the journey we've been on with everyone. So I'll go through each of them one by one. The first one is young people are internally driven to do well. This sounds like it makes sense, but it's actually a really big change in how we fundamentally understand young people as a whole. A lot of what people typically do at the moment is very focused on the idea that we sort of, as adults, have to sort of like mold and like shape young people to get them to become the best they can be. But this key acknowledgement is about recognizing that young people are intrinsically amazing as they are, and young people are internally driven to do well. So people are internally driven to meet three basic needs, which are autonomy, about having choice and control over your actions, relatedness, feeling connected with and accepted by the people around you. Sometimes people say people are choosing to like have fallouts with people and have bad behavior, but that doesn't make sense because people are innately driven to do well and have positive experiences with other people. And finally, competence. Every young person is intrinsically motivated to learn and develop skills. One of the things which is very common with our young people, and I promise them I would say this, is when young people are struggling to attend school, people have said that you should sort of get rid of games and make home really, really unfun and that sort of stuff to then sort of push people into school. But when we talk to young people in our community who have been out of school for a long time, almost every single one has said they don't want to game all day. Gaming all day is boring. Like people want to have more opportunities to learn outside of that as well. The problem is when people have struggled so much, people need to use it as a safety net and they use it as a way to cope with the difficulties they've experienced. When I was struggling when I was younger, I gamed all the time. Now that I'm older, I don't game as much. Well, that's a lie. I still game a lot, but I've moved from gaming as a coping strategy to gaming for fun. So some young people are stuck with it to cope, even if that isn't what they want right now, if that makes sense. Yeah. This slide's a little bit overwhelming, sorry about that. But when it comes to self-determination theory, it shares the idea that intrinsic motivation that's innate to you, is the most powerful. So as I said, people have these three basic needs that they are internally driven to meet. So when learning is focused around your three basic needs, people learn the best, they have a lot of motivation, and it's easier to engage in things. It's the idea of not wanting to learn because people tell me to. It's I want to learn because learning feels good. We want to talk about this more in the second webinar because it's quite a big concept. But it's important to mention for now because the schooling system accidentally interferes with this. Because as we said, young people are internally driven to learn, but when you look at the messages people commonly get about education, it's actually often very focused on fear of failure, and it's that thing of if you don't go to school, you won't do well. You're going to ruin your life chances, and every moment matters when you're in school. So it focuses on that idea of it brings fear rather than the recognition that young people are trying their best and young people want to learn. And what then happens is that fear then undermines the intrinsic motivation people have. So what I always say is it's every young person is born with like a spark, and you can see when people are talking about things they're passionate about or they're interested in. I think you can hear it in people's voices, and like you can see their eyes light up when we talk about that sort of thing. But then when things like fear and like coercion are brought into things, people start to lose that spark and focus a bit more on that sort of compliance. And when that happens, people can't learn as effectively. And what I think what we can see a lot of the time is people can sort of lose their spark and then like they gain it back after an extended period of time out of school where people gain the spark back. Or even as adults, lots of people think like, what am I doing with my life? I'm gonna ditch what I'm doing and like follow my passion or my dream, and people sort of get that back. Yeah. As I said, this is the focus of webinar 2, but I did want to share a few studies just because this might be a new concept to some people. So just as an example, I've got 3. So one study showed that high school students were given 5 different tasks, some testing memory, some testing creativity. Some people were rewarded to do it and some who weren't. Regardless of the task, the rewarded subjects didn't do nearly as well. There's a second study that shows preschoolers expected an award for a drawing, which felt tips. With felt tips, people who expected a reward drew at least as many pictures, but the quality was quite a lot lower. And then there's a first study which shows 12 and 13-year-olds were promised movie tickets for teaching younger girls to play a new game, and they did a worse job as tutors, got frustrated more easily, took longer to communicate ideas, and ended up with pupils who didn't understand the game, as well as those who learned from tutors who weren't promised anything. So again, it's that idea that people are innately driven to sort of learn and do things, and when we bring reinforcers into that, that then affects how people sort of learn and do things. I've written 52 studies here because there were 52 studies I found which sort of backed up these ideas. The reason I put 52 in like speech marks was because I got to 52 and I thought, like, how many more do I need to make my point? I'm just going to stop here rather than continuing to read lots more studies. So it's a lot more than 52, but I only looked at 52. So yeah, so the sort of key message here is if young people are struggling to attend school, since young people are intrinsically motivated to learn, there are some important factors to look at. So looking at well-being, looking at if people are psychologically safe, do people have unmet needs that need to be met? And again, we want to talk about this in webinar 2, but some sort of behavior-based systems themselves can be detrimental to young people attending school as well. I think on this point, the reason why we want to deep dive on it in the second webinar is like behaviors, practices, and the ideas of like rewards and punishments and that sort of stuff. They're a normal part of life. They're embedded into absolutely everything we do. So me saying that right now, you might be sat here thinking, what are you talking about? You're talking complete and utter nonsense. but because they are so part of everything we do. So I guess one point I wanted to make here is most of the people who've moved away from that approach to something new, it isn't because they've sort of done lots of research and sort of learned about it. It's often because they've had no other choice. So what we've seen is lots of young people who have been attending school, they reach a point of burnout or feel unable to attend. And then at that point, people have recognized, okay, the things that are sort of normal, the normal ways to sort of parent and support young people aren't working for my young person. We need to do something different. And when people have completely adapted what they've done, we see parents becoming absolute specialists, always on webinars and learning and reflecting to sort of get their young person to sort of regain their spark again and start to do things that we used to struggle to do. And I guess the point here is, rather than people having to get to that point for an approach to be adapted, can we share the right approach from the start, and how can we get people to get on board with that? And we know it's very tricky to get on board with it because it's very different to everything you're ever taught and what you're told is normal, but it's still really, really important. So yeah. The second key acknowledgement is we need the right approach for all young people. We talked about it a little bit earlier, but I think what you can see happen is, when people have a diagnosis of autism or ADHD or something like that, what then happens is people get the approach focused around EBSA, which is like more compassionate, it's more curious, it tries its best to focus on meeting underlying needs. As I said earlier, this approach isn't perfect, but it's better than the idea of truancy, where people use sort of fear and guilt and shame and don't recognize that young people want to do well. A few more important things to mention here. The impact of professionals believing young people are choosing their behavior. Again, that idea of when people get to choose between EBSA and truancy, what happens when you think people are choosing? Here are some quotes from people. I'll just read out a couple because you'll have the slides. School said he was choosing not to attend school until he eventually broke and then it was too late. My child's head teacher believed his inability to attend school was a choice and she could not be moved from that viewpoint. Another important point to mention here is looking at the current picture around diagnosis in the UK at the moment, because what is happening is there is a huge increase in demand for assessment for things like autism and ADHD, and waiting times are increasing, but there's not much of an increase in funding to match the increase in demand. So what's happening is waiting times are getting longer, less people are getting access to an assessment, and it's that key thing of actually young people need to get the right support before they get a diagnosis, not afterwards, especially since waiting times are getting longer. Often what happens is young people get a diagnosis and then they get adapted support. Like I think lots of people have shared when they go to CAMS, there's a typical approach, but then if someone has an autism diagnosis, there's a slightly adapted approach. But then what if someone's autistic and not diagnosed yet? Or what if they're autistic and they're on a 5-year waiting list? It's important to get the right approach for people before they reach a point of crisis. There was also a study which showed 80% of autistic females remain undiagnosed at the age of 18. Second to final point on this section is, even though the majority of people who have experienced long-term attendance difficulties are neurodivergent, it isn't a neurodivergent specific issue. So there are some stats which show that long-term attendance issues affect 5 to 28% of neurotypical pupils. So it isn't just neurodivergent people who need the right support, it's everyone. And one of the best examples of this is from a book, Square Pegs. So I'm just going to read it out. It says, what if our square pegs aren't the problem? What if they are actually the canaries in the mine, alerting us to the mounting problems in our education system? In her book, Troublemakers, Lessons in Freedom from Young Children at School, it discusses animal sentinels, animals which are purposely used to provide advance warning of disease, toxins, and other environmental threats to humans. She explains that these species are selected based on their height and I can't read today. I'll just say that word. Susceptibility to particular hazards. They are often sacrificed to save us. The most famous example is the canary. It was used in coal mines in the 20th century to give advance warning of deadly gases such as carbon monoxide. Because these birds were small and had particularly sensitive I can't speak. I can't read. Respiratory systems? The poison killed them quickly, leaving the miners with enough time to get out and save themselves. What if, suggests the author, we saw our square pegs as such canaries? And again, it's this idea which we think is really, really important, where if someone is struggling to attend school, it isn't about saying, this is our standard approach, here's our adapted approach for people who struggle. I think what we're seeing is there are current ways of working and supporting young people which aren't working for all young people, but we see the impact of that the most in the people who have a higher level of need, or where you have the biggest mismatch between that person's needs and the environment, which is why, again, the majority of people who might struggle are neurodivergent, but actually it's an issue that's affecting all young people, not just those. Does that make sense? Yeah, okay. The third point is about having the right support in the right place at the right time. So again, this is the idea of going back to the anxiety cycle and what's typically said. It's really important to say that if a young person is struggling to attend, returning to school really quickly isn't always the best option. One thing which is really important is looking at the environment and what changes can be made to make sure it better meets a young person's needs. And the second thing is when people experience things like burnout and long-term attendance difficulties, it's about giving people the time and support needed to recover. But also, since we've recognized right now, a lot of people are getting to that point of burnout where they have years of time to sort of recover and recharge in some cases. What can we do before people get to that point to give them the time and support proactively before they get to that sort of like point of no return, if that makes sense? Another point we wanted to acknowledge at this point is the schooling system in itself has absolutely huge challenges. So if a young person is struggling to attend school, it's really important to acknowledge that things are tricky as a whole. So a few of the things we wanted to talk about. One is there's been lots of feedback recently about the school curriculum and how, you know, lots of people think it would be cool to have some reform in sort of how the curriculum's delivered. Some examples are because it's very difficult to do things that you might not be interested in, but it's also reported to not always take into account the needs of employers, according to recent sort of stats. Another thing that people have said is there's a very huge emphasis on testing, but tests aren't always the best way to measure people's ability to sort of do things in adult life. And yeah, there's recent studies which show teachers can feel very overworked and undervalued, with many leaving the profession. Being a teacher, I've never been a teacher, but it's really, really stressful. And people, yeah, so 46% of teachers, 40% of senior leaders report experiencing anxiety. Another 28% of teachers and 19% of senior leaders report acute stress. And another thing I think it's important to say is one thing in the UK, which will be really hard to fix, is that a lot of the education sort of policies and strategies aren't always based on what young people need in the long term. It's the idea of there are elections every 4 years, so people need policies that get them re-elected 4 years later. So it would be epic if education was seen as separate and there was a long-term strategy rather than it changing every 4 years depending on the government. But there isn't one right now. So yeah. Oh yes, sorry. Just to mention to everyone quickly, So people have been sending lots of links in the chat. One of the things we're going to be creating after today is a Padlet. So a Padlet is a thing that has lots of resources and video, and you can add lots of things onto it. So we're going to put the recording of the session, the slides onto the Padlet, as well as lots of links to resources and other things that are relevant to today. So I hope that sounds okay. So if you're overwhelmed by the chat, that's okay. You can ignore it. We'll be sending that. Yeah. Again, one other difficulty is children's well-being levels are falling year on year. So things are getting harder for young people, which again makes it harder to feel safe to learn and as well. When I think about this quite a lot, one thing that we've heard people say is actually it's not just a schooling system issue because there's individual staff that can and should do better. And I wanted to talk more about this because I think it's really important. So I won't read through them all, but here are some quotes from young people around particular teachers or individuals who've had a really, really positive impact on their journey. But I think it's really important to acknowledge that there are some barriers for people to sort of have these different approaches. The Padlet can be shared with anyone, Mandy. Yeah. So one of two things that we think a lot about is actually there is so much which we as humans are conditioned to believe are the right ways to do things like behaviourist practice. Again, more in webinar 2. And then when you hear about the sort of flaws of approaches like that, and when people share the ideas of something new, I think that we can feel a lot of like feelings of shame or guilt when we recognize that there are ways which we can do things differently or in a better way. And actually that can stop us from doing what we need to actually change or adapt our practice. So even if, yeah, I don't know. I think a lot of sort of school staff, for example, might need a lot of like support and access to things like supervision, which isn't normal in the schooling system, to be able to sort of process the negative feelings that come with changing practice. The second thing is, as an education professional, there is so much stress and so many laws and guidelines and different things. So even if you share, for example, a better way of supporting young people, there's things like Ofsted, there are policies to follow, there's the amount of stress that people feel in a really, really underfunded system. But also if you share a new approach that might really, really work, there's lots of uncertainty and discomfort that comes with that. So if you're really stressed, even if you see it's the right way forward, you might be too stressed to be able to sort of try that new approach. So then people might default back to, okay, let's keep doing things how we're doing it. Not because they don't care and they're not really, really passionate, but just because it is a really bloody stressed out, difficult system that everyone's a part of. And for me, I think there's so many stories of individual sort of professionals who might have like done an approach that hasn't worked for a young person or that's been unhelpful, for us to be able to say the problem is the individual. I think it's a much more strategic, wider issue that needs to be looked at, again, which is why we want to have a really strong focus on that in this guidance. When we look at the schooling system, one thing we were interested in thinking about is what can the schooling system look like when it's done differently? So we've got 2 examples of countries who do things differently in a way that sounds much better. So this is Finland, and Finland is very different to England because teachers are given a lot more freedom in how they teach the curriculum. They don't have school inspections. You do 1 exam at the end of secondary education, and actually people are in school less. Teachers teach for 4 hours a day, and teachers have 2 hours for professional development and support and whatever they need. And even though there's much less formal time teaching, Finland consistently tops the sort of rankings for education in the world. Yeah. I won't go on, but there's loads. I can talk about it all day because it's really great. Another example is Estonia. So they are often, I think they're currently the top ranking European country according to the latest results. In Estonia, children start school at age 7, leaving a lot more time for play because play is really, really important for children. Schools have a very high degree of autonomy, and head teachers are free to decide how people's lives and the curriculum is shaped. There's also a lot more teachers. So there are twice as many teachers per pupil in Estonia than in England. So the education system is funded much better, and that then leads to better outcomes. Also, most schools also have a psychologist and counsellors on site as well, because it's recognised that having a nurturing environment is a priority. And how amazing would it be if this is how the education system was in the UK? So I guess like when we're coming together with this guidance, we're thinking about how can we make things the best they can be within the current system, but also like it would be really cool if there's education reform in the next few years when we can massively adapt to sort of look more into models like these, which seem to work a lot better. Yeah, I guess the sort of key things I was thinking about here is at the moment there is so much pressure to attend school, but this pressure can actually be an additional challenge and it can result in lots of stress-based decision making. And it's sort of the acknowledgement that everyone is doing the best they can within the current schooling system, which unfortunately isn't perfect at the moment. But also, if a young person is struggling to attend school, this usually isn't a problem within the young person or the family. There are other reasons external to that. The final acknowledgement, then it's a break. So this is just about the importance of recognizing the purpose of education. So in the UK, the quality of education and the thing which schools have to sort of like measure is like the grades that people get and things like attendance. But then we sort of have that wider question of are grades what are the most important? And I think one thing I think about a lot is like my personal story of sort of how I got to where I was today. Because interestingly, when I was at school, I actually got the best GCSEs in my school. So it was a school in quite like a poor area, and I don't remember. I think I got 8 A stars and 3 As, and people said, you know, I was a massive success and blah 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 blah. But then at the same time, there were lots of things that weren't considered because grades were the main thing that mattered. So at that time, I didn't have any friends. I was very different to most people, but didn't actually understand why. So I felt really lonely and really, really isolated. But also because of how I was supported, I had this idea of the only way to sort of be happy is to like fit in and be like everyone else. So I spent all of my energy focusing on trying to like be normal. And even though I survived through school, that then led up to, you know, I went through college, I went to university, and I still had this idea of I've learned I need to be like everyone else. I need to try my best to fit in. But it got to a point where I couldn't do it anymore. So I did well in my first year of uni. And then my second year, I went through the same thing that lots of young people are currently experiencing, where I got to a point of I spent all of my energy trying to fit in. And I just felt quite hopeless and stuck and thought like this isn't working. And I went from like going out all the time and going to uni to then not leaving my house whatsoever for 3 months. And unfortunately, I actually attempted suicide at that time as well because I was so focused on grades being all that mattered. I felt completely miserable and I sort of gave up and sort of like lost hope in everything. But luckily, I survived that. I had 3 years of burnout I had to recover from. But through those 3 years, I unlearned everything. I unlearned the ideas of, you know, you have to fit in and be like everyone else. I spoke to other people who'd been in a similar experience to me, and they said, you know, being autistic means you have to live a very different life to most people, but that can be a very happy one. And that sort of transformed my outlook on everything from that point onwards. And I feel like I spent 3 years slowly recovering and starting to go out into the world again. But that wasn't just recovery, it was also unlearning everything I learned about how to be and how to act so that I could learn to work out what things need to be like for me, if that makes sense. Yeah, so I guess what I'm thinking is like I was a success, but also in my view, I wasn't. And there's still a lot of sort of damage from the schooling system, which I'm still impacted by now. So it's just the message of education is much wider than just grades. So while schools and local authorities have to focus on them, we can still all keep in mind that education is much more than just that. And we spoke as a team, and I think our favourite sort of definition of education is this. It's education is the sum of everything a person learns that supports them towards living a satisfying and meaningful life. If we're looking at what education really is, this includes things outside of school. It's one thing I think about is when people come to Spectrum Gaming and we talk openly about autism, and people start to shift from being ashamed of autism to realizing actually who I am is okay, and having, you know, it's connecting with peers who are out of school and then people knowing, okay, I'm not alone. Maybe it's not me who's the problem. It's, you know, just speaking to someone and learning something new when you go out. All of those things are what education is. And yeah, I think it's break time, so let's leave it there. Let's have a 10-minute break. We'll come back at around 11:30. I've also got another question on the Mentimeter, just to ask what you think of what you've heard so far. So feel free to sort of share your thoughts, and they should come up on screen. Is it showing Mementi on screen right now? Yeah, okay. Let's come back at 11:32 then, if that's okay. Okay, we'll see you then. Okay, thank you. Welcome back, everyone. Thank you very much, everyone, for the feedback. It's really nice to see so much positive feedback as well. One of the things I did want to say though is like when you have a survey at the end, please also, if you can, please feel welcome to share stuff around like what do you think people might struggle with? What things do you think your area might need more support with if you want to use the guidance and the things we're working on? Because it's really great to hear positive things, but also we want this to be something that's usable and workable for people. So we'd love to hear that as well. But yes, thank you so much. And yeah, over to you, Rachel.
Yes, thank you, Andy. Hello and welcome back, everyone. In this section, we'll touch upon some further research that has informed our thinking, and then we'll go through what each letter of WARMTH stands for. As Andy mentioned at the start, WARMTH is a framework we're proposing could be used to organise support to both prevent and reduce barriers to education. Thanks, Andy. So what do the pupils themselves say helps? Claire Nielsen, an educational psychologist, worked with 2 autistic young people in an alternative provision to identify what helped them to return to education. And the themes in red were generated by the young people. And some quotes are included on this slide to illustrate these. The themes in blue were developed by their parents, and the overarching theme in purple was developed by Claire. The young people said that time was important, to be able to go at their own pace and not feel pressure to return to school too quickly. Motivation was also important, including opportunities for autonomy and to work towards their own goals. Control and some freedom of choice, alongside a safe environment and relationships with staff and peers, were also key. Emotions and a focus on well-being also helped. The young people said attending a school that met their needs improved their mental health. And for these young people, a diagnosis of autism was also important to them. It helped them understand themselves and their past experiences better, to reduce self-blame and shame, and felt it helped others to understand their needs. Go on to the next slide, Andy. For parents, a holistic and joined-up approach was central. Professionals working together to develop a shared understanding and way forward, and importantly, to reduce the need for families to have to keep retelling painful experiences. Support for parents themselves was also important, to help them understand complicated SEND systems and trust their instincts in knowing how to support their child, and what the journey back to learning may look like for them, to hold on to hope and optimism that little green shoots will eventually start to grow.
And so this is some research that I did back in 2021 as part of my doctoral research for my thesis. And I worked with Caroline, who's here now, and Louise Knox, who I think is here as an attendee, to look at 2 case studies really of 2 children who were able to return to school after the COVID lockdowns. And we looked at, within that school environment, within the family, what had happened that meant it was a positive experience for the young people and their families and allowed them to succeed. And there were 5 factors that came out of this, and I don't think any of them will be surprising based on what we've been talking about already today, but it's really reassuring to know that this does work when it's in practice. So the first thing that everybody spoke about was that really effective homeschool communication. And I've seen a lot in the chat so far today where that relationship breaks down. It's so damaging. And actually what we know is that when schools and families can work together and listen to each other, respect each other, it makes a massive difference to the child and their ability to attend school. Positive relationships with adults were also really important. So within school and also with their parents, they spoke about having adults around them who listened to them, who were calm, who were positive, made a massive difference, to their well-being and against their ability to attend school. A third theme that came out, which again I think is really key, is having practitioners, so the staff, who were able to reflect on what they were doing and were able to change what they were doing. So it's having professionals around you who have the capacity and the ability to say, okay, what I'm doing isn't working and I need to change it. And that openness to try something a bit different was really important. And also having that individualized approach. As we all know, one size fits all does not work for these children. And it's that ability to almost go back to the drawing board every single time. what exactly is happening for this individual child, family, school, what do we need to change? And listening to what the child was saying was really, really key within this. Lastly, was that ability to work with other professionals. And I know this has huge systemic factors limiting it, but for those that did experience success, they spoke about having access to other healthcare professionals, to educational psychology, who were able to give that specialist advice and support at the right point in their cycles of support and allow the school staff to put the right support in place, was really, really important. And this really aligns with the survey that we touched on earlier. So the survey that looked at the well-being of lots of children across the UK. Through those results, the two educational psychologists who did the survey have made some recommendations really for what they think a 21st century education system should look like. And some key themes that they touch on is that move towards a genuine and embedded trauma-informed and relational practice in schools. So moving away from that behaviour approach, which we all know the evidence doesn't support, and using that relational system. They also talk about what Andy mentioned earlier, that self-determination theory, which again, we all know through our practical experience and our own lived experience that it works. But again, it's in the research that that is exactly what we should be using. They also suggest an update of the national curriculum to be more in line with the needs and the demands of the 21st century, including that focus on the digital lives. And it was really interesting hearing Andy talk about Estonia and how they're already doing this, because that's exactly what they're suggesting we need to do in the UK. It's making sure our young people can have those digital lives in a safe way where they're ready to move on into adulthood in the new digital world. And lastly, again, aligning with what we're all talking about is making sure young people have access to that full range of activities, not just focusing on academic ability or improvement, but allowing young people to thrive in sport, in the arts, having suitable inside and outside spaces, and facilitating everybody to have that growth mindset, everybody to be competent and be brilliant in whatever suits them and allows them to thrive. So some bold recommendations, but absolutely backed, I think, what we all want to work towards.
Thanks, Shannon. And consistent with this are the survey results from 2,000 families completed by Square Peg, which highlighted flexibility, creativity, and reasonable adjustments rather than a one-size-fits-all approach as being key to unblocking barriers to education. This flexibility sits alongside a relational approach that puts well-being and kindness first and trusts parental experiences. It was felt that staff training and pastoral and mental health support enabled these types of approaches.
Okay, thank you very much. So for the next part, we now want to go through the warmth acronym which we've created. One of the things I think it's really important to mention here is what we've recognized is a lot of the support which people need when it comes to education is proactive. So this acronym isn't just about for when young people start to struggle to attend school and when people are already out, but it's aims to be really, really proactive of before any of that happens, if that makes sense. So what we're going to do is go through each letter of our acronym, and then after each of them, I'm going to move to a new slide on Mementi so that if there's any cool resources or links or research you think is related to each one, then feel free to put them in Mementi, so that can help us to inform the sort of next steps what we're doing together. So yeah, I hope this sounds okay, and I'll hand over to Hannah.
Hello. So I'm doing the W of warmth, which is well-being first. So if I could go on to my next slide. So, I mean, I think hearing the personal accounts of young people today has been so powerful and makes it really clear why well-being has to come first. But I think when we're thinking about why well-being needs to be prioritized in terms of learning, we're hearing more and more about young people attending school but not actually learning. So I've got a quote here from the Sawyer and Collingwood study. So I think she'd been so stressed at school that she hadn't taken on anything that the teachers were saying, because literally it was taking everything she had to just stay in the lesson. She was there in body, but not in mind, really. And this really fits with what we know about the brain and neuroscience. And I've linked in the Beacon House resources, which I think are really an excellent resource. But learning requires a critical brain, and young people experiencing school-based distress are likely to be in the brain stem, that primitive part of the brain that Andy was talking about earlier, which is responsible for survival. So if young people are focused on survival, they just simply, they don't have the resources for higher processes needed for good cognitive functioning and to learn. And I think, if we apply this to ourselves, thinking about like maybe the most stressful day we've had where we know we're in fight or flight, if someone were to come along and try and give you lots of new information, how much of that are you likely to take in? Next slide, please, Andy. And I've seen in the chat, and we've heard from young people and parents and teachers lots of accounts of times where young people are going into school. They're marked as an attendance figure often, but they're so distressed that they're not able to spend time in the classroom. So they're either in distress in toilets, in the corridors. And there's a quote here from our survey. So on numerous occasions, after physically being forced into school, he was then left crying in the corridor all morning. All these things have been extremely unhelpful and caused significant distress to my son. Schools need to stop putting attendance above mental health. And I think we've touched on this so far, but putting wellbeing first may mean that a quick return to school isn't always best for the young person's wellbeing and for their learning. So next slide, brilliant, thank you. So what do we mean by wellbeing? And these are just really initial thoughts so far, because we really want to work with young people, the wider team, and hear what you've got to say in the Mentee as well about what wellbeing actually looks like. So some of the initial thoughts that we've had from the research and young people and parents is that it's about school wellbeing and psychological safety, but also we've heard lots of the studies on the importance of belonging, connection and community, having meaningful friendships, and those being both inside and outside of school. Access to social activities, opportunities to practice and pursue interests, opportunities for understanding yourself and self-discovery and accepting yourself, having really safe and accommodating surroundings that adapt to meet need. And of course, we've heard lots of accounts from parents about what a clearly stressful time this is. So, and staff as well. So we've been thinking that in the guidance, we'll need to think about supporting and promoting the wellbeing of staff and parents so that they in turn can support and co-regulate young people and maintain and promote really strong relationships. And I think this is just a really nice diagram that I think, although it says building our neurodivergent kids up and is from NeuroWild, I think applies to all people, where it's really essential to have those kind of aspects of well-being that we've been talking about, so strengths and positive identity and safety and regulation in place before we start thinking about the higher things like academics and learning. And I really love this quote. So well-being above everything else, academic success will only come when a child feels safe and regulated. And as we've heard, learning comes naturally when young people feel psychologically safe.
In case it's helpful, actually, since people are joining, I was going to share this a bit later on, but one of the things that we're hoping to create is what I think we're calling like the warmth approach framework. So it aims to look at like each section of this acronym and then look at like the what, so what different people can do. So what can senior leaders do at a school that's in line with the framework? What can teachers do on a class-wide level? What can a local authority do? What can health professionals do? And then have a section focused on sort of strategies and advice and what's helpful. But then the second part, which I think is really, really important, is also the how. So when teachers are in a really stressed system, they might recognize that something different is helpful. But when you're really stressed and overwhelmed, and how do you support people to get to that point? So we want to have the what, a list of strategies and advice and resources. But again, the most important thing, which we think is typically missing from a lot of advice, is how do people actually implement it in practice? Yeah, okay, let's move on to affirming practice then, if that's okay. I'll go back to the slides. Thank you.
Yep. So the A in warmth is for affirming practice. So humans are similar to plants in lots of ways. So there are lots of different species of plants and all need different conditions to thrive. So some need lots of water, some need less. Some need sunlight, some need darkness. And even if plants are the same species, they all look and grow differently and are unique. And some of that's because of their DNA and some is because of their environment. And just as plants need different things in order to thrive, people need different things in order to thrive as well. So when we've been thinking about affirming practice, I want to acknowledge that neurodiversity, I mean, we could have hours on this, but as a kind of brief overview, we've been thinking about neurodiversity as the idea that all humans are different and that this difference doesn't have to be seen as a disorder. And we've been thinking about how important it is to think beyond a diagnosis when seeking to understand neurodiversity. And I think that's really important for this guidance, given especially what Andy was mentioning earlier around the current picture around diagnosis. So developmental differences mean that a one-size-fits-all approach will not work well for many children, whether they fit a diagnostic criteria or not. And starting with the individual is a key part of affirming practice. Copy and paste approaches just don't work if you're not considering the individual at the centre. And even when those copy and paste approaches are built around strategies for a particular neurotype, for example, we hear about autism strategies, if they are copied and pasted and you're not placing the individual at the centre, they're not going to work for young people. And there's a really nice article on this that I've linked that's by Naomi Fisher, who talks about we need to think about how our education system could accommodate the whole range of developmental variation, and we need to acknowledge that this variation could be far wider than many of us appreciate. Okay, next slide, thank you. So this is an example of a framework created by the Anna Freud Centre for the Early Years. So the celebratory pathway asks people to consider individuals' interests, strengths, traits, differences and needs, and they acknowledge that all children have different needs that will need support, scaffolding and adaptive practices. So we're hoping to work with young people, the wider team, and yourselves in the Mentee to think about what affirming practice would and should look like for the guidance. That's me, Andy.
The next section, the R, is about having a relational approach. As I said, we're not focusing on this now. This is for webinar 2. Just had a few things to say. I think one of the main things I wanted to say here is often when people talk about having a relational approach, sometimes people will say, actually, that doesn't work because we need to focus on their behavior. We can't let people get away with anything and all that sort of stuff. And I think a really important sort of misconception is that exact idea. So you can have a relational approach, but still have agreed sort of like rules or expectations or ways of working together. But again, since that doesn't seem to always be common knowledge, that's one of the things which we want to explore more in depth in the second webinar. We've got a slide from Shannon.
Thank you, Andy. And yeah, just wanted to touch back in, I guess, on some of the research base around this, which again, just really reiterates what we've already been talking about. So Hamilton's 2024 paper, very recent, did a bit of a review really of lots of the literature around school attendance difficulties and neurodiversity from the last few decades. And as part of their summary, they made these 3 really key points, which I think absolutely align with this warmth and particularly the need for this relational approach. So the first point they make is that rewards and punishments don't work. So there is evidence base that they don't work. It's not just what we're saying from experience. It's not just sort of professional opinion, but there's evidence around that. They also suggest this multiple systems of support. And I know Andy's going to talk a lot more later on about what we're proposing that support to look like. But exactly, I think, as lots of you have said in the chat already, they're saying not only do we need those individual support for those children who are experiencing it and at risk, but it needs to be part of a broader, universal, whole school approach and almost that tiered, like a pyramid of support, really, so that everybody is accessing what they need for school to be successful. And within that, there's those whole school approaches. So again, they're really talking about that need to understand and celebrate neurodiversity, making sure that everybody feels they belong within school, whatever that needs to look like for them, and for schools really to try and be as inclusive as possible in terms of meeting everybody's needs.
Thank you. And while we said we're focusing on it in the next webinar, this is a really cool resource I wanted to share for if you're thinking, like, what can we do right now? So this is from Dr. Naomi Fisher, and it's called the Trust Test. And it's a tool which can be used to evaluate interventions for when a young person's struggling to attend school. So the things to look at are time limited. Is there a time limit? Sometimes, like we said earlier, when young people struggle to attend school, there's often that focus of, let's do small steps and get them back in quickly. But actually, can you set a time? Because if it doesn't work after a set amount of days or weeks or whatever, it's not going to work. So it's not helpful to keep trying. The second thing, looking at reasons, not just reactions. So what are the reasons behind the child's emotional or behavioral reactions? The third one, does it increase unhappiness? If the approach increases unhappiness, that is not going to be helpful, because young people need to be happy and feel safe to be able to learn. Again, with that common idea at the moment of, if someone is struggling to attend school, make home less safe and they'll be able to go into school. That actually contradicts what young people need. What we see young people need is have a really safe foundation, have a place at home where they feel psychologically safe, so that they have a safe place to move out from, to then go and do the thing they are motivated to do, which is learn. Fourth is shame. Does it use shame if a child doesn't do what is wanted? Shame is one of the most powerful emotions, so it's really important to avoid it as much as possible. And finally, trust. Is this going to build the child's trust in adults? If it isn't, it won't be a very helpful strategy. Again, we're looking at it in the next webinar, but still, we'll go back to the Menti, and feel free to add your thoughts or suggestions if that's okay. The next section is on mutual understanding and partnership. This is over to Kirsty.
Yeah, I'm really fidgety, sorry, after sitting still for 2 hours now. I'm going to move while I talk a lot. So mutual understanding and partnerships, that's the M in warmth, which is what we want to look at now. So you can move on to the first slide. So I've just taken these two examples from some of the main legislation relating to working with children. But we know that all legislation and guidance, everything around any work with children, education, barriers to attendance, barriers to education, and we know advocates for working together. So among services, among professionals, with families, with children. And we know that success means working together as well. And when I speak to, in my work, so I work with families, I work with schools and different services, I know that teachers, Senkos, social workers, CAMS workers all want the best for the children they're working with. We know that, and we know that that's what the legislation suggests as well and asked us to do. So I can move, thank you. So when I'm working with families and services, the focus is always on working together and gathering the views of children and young people and their parents. But what I hear again and again from parents, and I'm sure that we all hear this, is that their views aren't taken into account. They feel that they're not listened to, they're not heard, they're not believed. But also what I hear again and again from professionals and services is that they're struggling to help parents and children to engage and struggling to get that, to hear their voices and to build that trust. So what we think about with the M in warmth is, how can we bring this together? So these are just some of the things that get in the way, some of the barriers. So in my work through the years as a social worker, I used to think a lot about what we assume that everybody's doing their best. So initially it used to be about kind of children, and I'd explore with people. Children are always doing their best, which is what we've talked about a lot this morning. So if they're struggling to do something, what's getting in the way? But actually what I've started to do more and more and realised important is actually we can apply that to everybody. So we can apply that to the parents we're working with, we can apply that to social workers, to teachers, and again to services. So we always think, actually, if there's a barrier, if there's something getting in the way, what is that? And that helps us to be curious and think about what we can do about it. And what I've done here is just picked out a few of the things that do get in the way of working together and that mutual partnership working. And I've just put them all on the same slide. So some of them are barriers for children or for parents, some of them are barriers for professionals, but actually we know we all want the same things ultimately for children. So I've put them all together. So I'm just going to talk about a few of them. Sorry, Andy. Just a few examples just to expand a little bit more. So Parental trauma. I clearly remember something that hadn't occurred to me before, a secondary school teacher telling me that she often encountered parents who couldn't enter the classroom for meetings because of their own school trauma and their own difficult history in school, which is something that had never occurred to me until she said that. And also parental trauma at the processes. So I know, having read in the chat, I can see a lot of people have had very similar experiences to I have, and a lot of the families I work with, and a lot of the SG parents as well, is actually the processes that you have to go through, the kind of the red tape, the meetings, the you know, bouncing between services, the barriers that you come up against, actually what the impact that has as a parent when you're passed to another service or going through another kind of assessment process or whatever it might be. Something that really jumped out at me with my own experiences as well is when, as a family, we were first experiencing barriers to education, and everything all seemed to kind of happen at once. Is I was at that point, I was managing a social work team in a local authority, and I would be going into a meeting one moment as a team manager and feeling that I was listened to and heard and that my voice was kind of respected. And then I'd be going into a meeting as a parent and noticing that in the minutes, I remember particularly from one assessment, that everything I said as a parent was put in quote marks, but it wasn't for anybody else. And actually that had a big impact on how I then interacted with people, I suppose. Staff workloads we've talked about a lot, and I think I've seen that on the Menti as well, people saying a lot about staff needing to feel safe, staff needing to have that supervision and support. Another barrier is the focus on the child's behaviour. So, you know, feeling that maybe it's a choice, whereas other people might see a child's distress, and actually the fact that can lead to a breakdown in trust or difficult approaches being used as well. And then, as Andy said earlier, and I think it's come up a few times, the priorities on attendance and behaviour that put such pressure on schools and attendance teams and local authorities. I'm not going to go through everything there. So if we move on to the next one. So these are just some of the things from research, which we've talked about a lot this morning, and speaking to families and services. These are some of the things that can help. And I've put this quote in from Maya Angelou: do the best you know, the best you can until you know better. And then when you know better, do better. I mean, that resonates for me as a parent. I know there are lots of things that I have done through the last kind of 4.5 years that I would have done differently, and before that, had I known more. You know, I don't, obviously I regret things, but I luckily, because of, you know, the people I'm surrounded with now, I know that I did the best I could at the time. But also as a professional as well, I'm learning all the time. And I think it's important to note when I go through this that actually through this process, what we want is everybody's input to be able to identify how we can help working together, how we can help this to work better within the warmth approach. So a few of the examples to mention here: it's important to believe children and parents, even if we're not seeing in a particular setting that what parents are saying maybe is happening at home, or what a child is saying that they're feeling. It's important to believe that that's happening. Where should I go next? Recognising that it's important that we need time to build trust. It takes time, especially if people have had difficult experiences of services before, have had to engage with a number of services, particularly for children. I know that children will often have to see a number of different people through the whole kind of process, for want of a better word. Considering the whole family, so linking to what Hannah was talking about well-being first, and genuine partnership working. So, you know, that feeling that we're working together, and I think some of the best experiences that people report having, and I know for me as well as a parent, with professionals, is actually that idea of, yes, we've got these barriers, yes, there's you know, there might not be enough provision, or we know that things are taking too long, we know that the waiting lists are too long, whatever the barriers might be, but actually we're in this together and we'll try and find a way to do it together. And flexibility, people gave me some lovely examples for this. So an example was a child who the head teacher allowed them to attend for 2.5 days a week, and then it reduced to 1 day a week. And then at the end, that 1 day a week was them watching TV in a quiet place with friends. And that child didn't go back to that school full time. They did end up with a different sort of provision that worked for them. But actually, what their parent expressed was the gratitude that the head teacher had allowed that flexibility, because what it did was protect that child in terms of their self-esteem and help them to feel like part of the school, which then enabled them to be able to access the next steps. And it's just recognising how important that is and how much difference that can make to a child's life. Yeah, one young person said, responding to the type of day I'm having. So, you know, flexibility in terms of kind of the general approach, but also just day to day or moment to moment as well. And there's a few examples on here I haven't gone through, but just curiosity, I mean, that comes up in everything we do, is thinking about the barriers and assuming that people are doing the best they can. So thinking actually what could be getting in the way here, for parents to be able to work with us, or for children to be able to give their views or whatever it is we're looking at the time. And yeah, just before we move on, just a reminder that actually what we're doing through this process is trying to get everybody's views so that we can make this framework work. Thanks, Andy.
Awesome, thank you.
So yeah, I'm just going to talk a little bit about the importance of a timely response. And I think, as lots of you with personal experience will know, the sooner we put support in place and recognise that children are experiencing difficulty, the more effective we can be. So next slide, please, Andy. Thank you. So as part of my research, I did a literature review. So I looked at all of the research that had been done in the UK in the last 10 years, working with young people experiencing this. There wasn't very much, as a bit of a spoiler, but it did result in about 60 children and young people who'd shared their views through research. And I think some of the papers I drew from, I can see author names in the chat today. So I'm probably referencing some of your research, which is great. And within that, what young people shared overwhelmingly was that support was not in place early enough. Lots of them described their non-attendance from school as something that happened very gradually. They were ground down over time, and actually, had support been put in place earlier, they don't think they would have reached a point where they couldn't attend school at all. Interestingly, lots of them described it as a very logical and understandable response to their situation. Exactly what Andy was talking about earlier. These are not irrational things or mental health difficulties that are innate. It's actually things in their environment that made it really, really hard for them. And for them, that was the only option that made sense, was to withdraw and take themselves away from that difficult situation. All of the children and young people as well spoke a lot about wanting to be at school. Many of them still wanted to be at school and were working hard towards that, but they spoke about, without the right support and changes to the environment, they just didn't see it as something that was possible for them. And they all spoke about the fact that not going to school negatively impacted their well-being. It wasn't something that they enjoyed or found interesting. Lots of them spoke about being extremely bored at home, but actually they just couldn't get in because school was so difficult for them. And I think a really important point that was made is that somebody, I think, as well said in the chat earlier, lots of children and young people can't always articulate this experience through distress or through sort of their ability at communication, but they do tell us this through their behaviour. And that's where it's really important to listen and to recognise those warning signs, listen to the families and the people who know the child best. And as soon as we have those worries, to act on them and to change things for the young person. Thank you, Andy. So within the experiences that they shared, there were lots of factors that came up quite often. So while we talk about, you know, there's definitely not a one-size-fits-all approach here, there were lots of common themes really to what the children spoke about. So of all of those experiences, they spoke about 4 different things that often led to the onset of their difficulties, or that sort of led to them beginning to experience distress in school. The first of these was difficult relationships with their peer group, either through bullying, not feeling included, or not getting on with the other children in school. They spoke about having really inconsistent relationship with adults. So while there might be 1 or 2 teachers that they felt really listened to them, there were others who did the opposite. And actually the rules and expectations were different from classroom to classroom. And that was something that they found really stressful. Lots spoke about negative experiences of school transition. And again, that big difference between a primary or a secondary, or moving from year groups or class teachers, making a massive difference to the expectations and how they felt included. And then lots also spoke about negative experiences of learning in school. And so this could have been through an unmet learning need, or through just not perceiving the learning as interesting or presented in a way that made sense to them. They then spoke about 3 things that maintained their difficulties. So these were not things that necessarily triggered the school distress, but they're things that sort of perpetuated it and made it carry on. And interestingly, this was where they spoke about their emotional well-being and mental health. The vast majority of the children, young people that were surveyed, that were spoken to or sort of had their views captured, weren't anxious, they weren't depressed prior to these difficulties starting. They talked about the mental health as a consequence of their difficulties within school. They also spoke about other people having negative perceptions of them. They were very aware when adults called them lazy or implied it was a choice or that they weren't wanting to come in. And they found that really, really difficult, because if that's what you're hearing everybody around you say, you start to doubt your own experience, don't you? And actually, it was really important for them to be acknowledged by the adults around them for what they were really experiencing. And as we touched on earlier, their own beliefs about education and about attendance were really important here. So those children, young people who saw going to school as purposeful and as something that would have a positive impact on their life were more likely to go in. For those that couldn't see the purpose in it, they were much less likely to be able to keep attending. And all of this had that cumulative experience over time. So that really key point of, as soon as we recognize some of these things not working, putting that support in straight away to stop it building up and snowballing and having that massive effect on the child. Next slide, please, Andy. And so how do we do this? And I think this is something that lots of you here today will know lots about, but I think it's really important that we ask the child, we listen to them, and we act on what they've said. This isn't about tokenistic, sitting down and having a chat and then putting it in their file and forgetting about it. It's about doing something with their views. And there are lots and lots of ways. I won't talk all day about the different ways that we could do this, but some of the strategies that we might suggest are using card sort activities, just having a conversation with the child. In Trafford, we use our early identification of need tool, which I know is still under review, but thinking about who knows the young person, how can we capture their views effectively and keep capturing them, speak to them through these cycles of support. Is it working? Is it not working? And making sure that we act on what we're told as soon as we're told it. Thank you, Andy. And so this is, again, not an exhaustive list at all, but what might delay this timely response? What sort of things do we need to be mindful of? Waiting for a diagnosis comes up a lot. I think it's really important to stress that you don't need a diagnosis to access support in school. Schools do not need a medical note to make reasonable adjustments to the school environment, so that is not a reason to delay support. Again, huge waiting lists for mental health, so for CAMS or for specialist assessment. I know for psychology support can be a really long wait, and that can be really unhelpful for the child and their family. We also hear a lot about children presenting differently between home and school, that, well, they're fine in school, but we know they're not. They're telling us through their behaviour that they're not. And again, it's really important that we listen and we act on that straight away. As well, not looking beyond the behaviour, so treating it as a behavioural difficulty through sanctions, through exclusions, but not recognising what the child is actually communicating. As we spoke a lot about earlier, the focus on attendance we know is really harmful, because you might have a child with 100% attendance who is in fight or flight mode all day, every day, and that is equally unhealthy. So that's really important as well. Access to information. I know this is something, again, that's come up a lot in my own work in the local authority, but it's making sure that families and professionals have the information somewhere they can access it and have that training. And then lastly, it's that referral to inappropriate services. So it's thinking about actually who can help, where should we be referring to, and what can we do to make sure this response is really timely and helpful for the child. So as I said, I know that's not an exhaustive list. I'm sure you've probably got lots of your own ideas as well about what might delay that support, but it's really helpful, I think, for us to bear these in mind and think about how can we overcome and mitigate really for lots of these things when we're working with families and children.
Awesome.
Thank you, Andy.
Okay, back to the mentee for timely response. That was okay, thank you. One thing I wanted to quickly mention while people are suggesting things, there was a conversation in the chat about fabricated and induced illness, and I think one of the things, like my personal view, I don't know if anyone has anything to add, is that when you look at what it means, it's actually like the stats show it's actually something that's really rare and is considered as quite a serious form of child abuse. So if you look at the stats around this from the NHS, it shows 89 in 100,000 parents what's the word? Do it? I don't know. So that's 0.089% of parents. But then when you look at statistics, for example, we're not finding school group did a study, and it showed 18% of parents of young people who have young people who struggle to attend school are accused of fabricating and induced illness. That is an absolutely astronomical difference between the two. So what happens then is lots of parents are accused of something that is very, very serious. That then has a detrimental impact on the well-being of parents, but also what you tend to see is if a young person studying at school, for example, it might appear fine if they talk to professionals, or it might appear fine at school, but then what happens is young people go home and that's their safe space. So that's where they let everything out. So as a professional, you might not see a young person's distress. That doesn't mean it's not real. It's often very, very real, but you might not see it because you're not their safe person. So I think that's something that's really, really essential to keep in mind. Yeah, there's lots of research and other studies around parents being accused of fabricated or induced illness and the amount of harm it causes, especially when the majority of the time it isn't actually true. But yeah.
Okay, thank you, Andy. Yes, so the final letter is H for holistic support, and this is about gaining an in-depth understanding of the situation and a support plan that then reflects this, that considers individual needs and doesn't focus in a very superficial way on what may appear to be the presenting issues. As Shannon has just mentioned, it's really typical for children to say they don't know why attending school has become so difficult for them. And it's because it is so multi-layered and it is so complex. So we go on to the next slide, please, Andy. You'll recall from earlier in the webinar, Caroline mentioned the interlinked nature of attendance barriers, and some local authorities like Lancashire now reference the Brenner system theory, which is shown in the image on the right, within their guidance. And this highlights how systems around children are interlinked and shape their development, from their immediate family and school experiences to what's happening at a national level in terms of government policies and priorities and the language that is used around attendance. As Caroline also mentioned, conclusions drawn from the Impact Ed summary of children's views in England, things that reduce children's attendance like disadvantage and inequalities, overlapping rather than isolated and distinct. It becomes very complicated and interlinked. So when it comes to attendance, we really need to think about the interconnected nature of these challenges. And Burton Shaw and Dorrell's work with parents has highlighted the complexity of issues across the education system and beyond. And therefore, a multi-agency approach is needed to address and reduce these. And often what I see in my casework is that when situations are very stressful and feel very stuck, it's natural to slip into feeling others aren't doing enough. And I think that's what leads to the communication breakdown, where schools start to blame parents and parents start to blame schools. So thinking bigger picture can help move away from this and support the partnership work Kirsten's just been speaking about. And there are examples of where this has started to work well. So if we go into the next slide, Andy. The pink table on the right highlights this interconnected nature. So this summarises the themes from across 105 families working with a family health practitioner in a Greater Manchester local authority. And these practitioners are part of the early help team, but are linked to secondary schools and work directly with families to co-create holistic support plans. And themes were generated from support in the autumn 2023 term and highlight needs beyond the presenting attendance or education barriers, which were as shown on the slide. So a lot of families experienced health needs, there were family relationship difficulties, and there were difficulties around finances and housing that also needed to be addressed in order to result in positive outcomes and support that child's attendance. And even if there aren't financial or relationship difficulties to begin with, these may arise as attendance difficulties become more long-standing. Seeing your child struggle is hugely stressful for parents, which can impact their family relationships, and finances may be impacted if a parent has to reduce their working hours or stop working altogether. And there are examples of where this wider whole family approach has started to be taken. So, for example, Bernardo's have been commissioned by the DFE to provide an attendance mentoring programme called the Watchtower Project, which starts with a detailed holistic understanding, and then practitioners work with the family for up to 20 weeks. And following the first year pilot in Middlesbrough, the project has now been rolled out in 4 other local authorities and is set to run through to March next year in Stoke-on-Trent, Doncaster, Knowsley and Salford. And the school home support team, which initially began in East London but now works in multiple areas across England, also has practitioners that are linked to individual schools or across several schools and work with the whole family to identify barriers to attendance, looking beyond the classroom to find the root cause of absence. They estimate that to support one child for a year using this model costs half the amount the Greater Manchester Combined Authority estimated it currently costs for an individual once their attendance drops below 10%. So their campaign, Dig a Little Deeper, is calling for the government to help schools and families by funding more earlier whole family support. Okay, thanks.
Okay, I'll keep that open, but I'll move on if that's okay. So what's next? So we have a few ideas around resources and things we would like to do. But again, please feel free to give your feedback and input. The reason why this is such a short part of the webinar is because we're aiming to do this in collaboration. So we haven't started developing these yet. The plan is to have them done by September in partnership with people who would like to work with us. So the first thing is we want to create a website on barriers to education. Oh, I need to switch my screen. That's helpful. Thank you. One of the reasons for a website is often you can get quite lengthy guidance around things like emotional-based school avoidance, but it's like 70 pages and it's really long and really overwhelming. So we want to have it so that we can split it into people getting the information they need to know rather than everything. And we can do that by formatting it through a website. We're hoping we have 3 different tiers to the website. So one section, the biggest section, is about those preventative school-wide approaches. This aims to look at guidance for people at different levels. So local authority levels, school senior leaders, classroom-wide approaches, individual approaches. Also, as I talked about, developing the warmth framework for schools, so schools can look at what to do, but also sort of how to do it and how to sort of make that part of standard practice if it feels a bit tricky right now. For when young people start struggling to attend, we aim to develop an audit tool using the framework so that we can then go to a school, people can look at which areas they might be struggling with, which areas are going well, and then work with people from local authorities, from health services and wider teams to sort of make a plan together around that. We plan to look at and review some of the tools that exist on an individual level for when a young person's struggling to attend school. For example, in Trafford, there's an early identification of needs tool, and we have a team of young people who would like to sort of look at that and work together with it. So we've got the individual level stuff with that tool, as well as the wider school level stuff from the audit tool. And finally, when it comes to long-term absence, having some work around burnout recovery. If people's have been out of school for a very long time, what's helpful, and how do we support people to feel able to learn again? The aim is for the website, again, as I said, it will have different information depending on your remit, but also have things like accompanying handouts to share with parents, services, or supporting professionals. So if there's something which is really important for your young person and your school might not have attended this training, for example, you can have a handout that's sort of supported by the team, which you could then take to school to sort of help them know where to learn more and find different bits of guidance. In terms of the website structure, there's only 3 more slides, sorry. In terms of the website structure, again, we want to make sure people have the opportunity to learn some of what you've heard today, some of the stories, some of the research behind the change that we're making. So have a section focused on the case for change, sharing more stories behind change. So we have young people and parents who would like to make videos, art, and other bits of content to sort of show people the case behind it. Having the key principles and the theory behind them, and then going on to the idea of the what people can do, but also the how. So then it'll be split into different areas for each service, but also you can go to different sections based on where you're up to. So are you at the point of learning about things? Are you at the point of knowing what to do, and that sort of thing? So we talked about working in partnership. So when this webinar ends, please do answer the survey if you can. The recording and accompanying resources, we're putting it on a Padlet board so you can use it, you can share it with whoever you'd like to. We've got 2 future sessions coming up, so feel free to join them on our journey. And finally, we are looking for more collaborators. So in the survey, please feel free to share your skills and experience and knowledge, and then we can work out the best way for the right people to work together. I wanted to show our team again because I just think it's a really awesome team that we wanted to sort of like celebrate together, and also say that you can be a key part of this too if you'd like to. And yeah, that's it. Thank you very much for coming. Yes. I think that's everything. I think we're done. So thank you so much everyone for coming, and yeah, hopefully speak to everyone soon. We'll send the recording and resources out within 10 days if that's okay. So it will be coming. But thank you so much, and bye-bye. Bye.